The oak trees cast long shadows across the white-columned mansion as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the Alabama hills. Oak Haven Plantation stood as a testament to wealth built upon the broken backs of human beings, its splendor a stark contrast to the squalid quarters that housed those who maintained it. Among the rows of cotton that stretched to the horizon, backs bent under the scorching sun, a man named Solomon worked silently, his eyes downcast, but his mind calculating each second of daylight remaining. Solomon Thomas had been born into bondage 32 years prior, but unlike many others, he could read. This dangerous skill had been taught in secret by his mother, who had served as a house slave in the previous master's home. Now, this forbidden knowledge existed as both blessing and curse, a window into a world denied to him, yet a constant reminder of the freedom that existed beyond his reach. "Boy, get yourself to the house. Mistress is asking for you," barked Overseer Williams, his bullwhip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent. Solomon's stomach tightened. Being summoned to the main house rarely meant anything positive. He quickly placed his picking sack on the ground and made his way through the fields, aware of the eyes of other enslaved people following him with a mixture of concern and relief that it wasn't them being called. Oak Haven belonged to the Caldwell family, headed now by the recently widowed Elizabeth Caldwell, a woman of 27 whose husband had died under mysterious circumstances 6 months prior. Rumors circulated among both the enslaved community and neighboring plantation owners, but none dared speak them aloud. What was known was that since Master Caldwell's death, the mistress had changed. Once known for her charitable nature and relatively mild treatment of the enslaved compared to other plantation owners, Elizabeth Caldwell had become reclusive, unpredictable, and, according to the house slaves, prone to fits of rage, followed by periods of inconsolable weeping. Solomon climbed the whitewashed steps to the back entrance, wiping his brow and trying to remove as much dust from his clothing as possible. Before he could knock, the door swung open to reveal Agnes, the head house slave. "She's in the study," Agnes whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the corridor that led deeper into the house. "Be careful, Solomon. She's in one of her moods." Solomon nodded, understanding the warning. He made his way through the pristine hallways, adorned with European paintings and expensive furnishings, each step careful and measured. The contrast between this opulence and the crude cabin he shared with 5 other men was not lost on him. The door to the study was ajar, and through the gap Solomon could see Elizabeth Caldwell seated at her husband's desk, a glass of amber liquid in her hand. Her black mourning dress made her skin appear even paler than usual, and her auburn hair was pulled back severely from her face. "Enter!" she called out before he could announce himself. Solomon stepped into the room, keeping his eyes respectfully downcast as expected. "You called for me, mistress?" Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, taking a sip of her drink. "Solomon, you were my husband's favorite, weren't you? He always said you were intelligent, for your kind." Solomon remained silent, knowing no response was required or desired. "I've been told you can read. Is that true?" Her voice was soft but carried an undercurrent of danger. Fear shot through Solomon's body. Reading was forbidden for slaves in Alabama. The law punished both the enslaved person who learned and anyone who taught them. Being literate could result in whipping, amputation, or worse. "I know some letters, mistress," he admitted carefully, calculating that honesty might be safer than a lie she could disprove. Elizabeth smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Perfect. That's precisely why I've called you here. I need someone with discretion, someone who understands words but knows when to remain silent." She rose from her chair and walked to a bookshelf, removing a leather-bound volume. "Do you know what this is?" Solomon glanced at the book. "It appears to be a Bible, mistress." "Indeed. And do you know what we do with Bibles, Solomon?" "Read scripture, mistress. We confess." Elizabeth's eyes gleamed with something that made Solomon's skin crawl. "We confess our sins to seek absolution. But I find myself unwilling to confess to Pastor Wilkins, who gossips with his wife about every whispered transgression." She took another drink. "So I've decided you will be my confessor instead." Solomon struggled to keep his expression neutral. "Mistress, I don't understand. I'm not a man of God." Elizabeth laughed, a brittle sound that echoed off the book-lined walls. "No, but you're a man who values his life, I presume. And that makes you ideal for my purpose. You will listen to my confessions every evening, and you will never speak of them to another soul." She moved closer, close enough that Solomon could smell the whiskey on her breath. "If you do, I'll have your tongue cut out before they hang you. Is that clear?" "Yes, mistress." "Good." She returned to her desk and pulled out a key, unlocking a drawer and retrieving a small leather-bound journal. "Starting tomorrow night, you will come to this study after dinner. No one is to know the nature of our meetings." She paused, studying him intently. "Do you fear God, Solomon?" "I do, mistress." "Then perhaps you are qualified after all. God sees all of our sins, doesn't he? But unlike Pastor Wilkins, he keeps them to himself." She dismissed him with a wave. "That will be all for now." As Solomon made his way back to the fields, his mind raced with confusion and dread. What sins could the mistress possibly want to confess to an enslaved man? And what would happen to him once he became the keeper of her secrets? The following evening, after completing his work in the fields and eating the meager rations provided, Solomon was escorted to the main house by Agnes. The other enslaved people watched with curious eyes, but none dared ask questions. "She hasn't eaten all day," Agnes whispered as they approached the house. "Just keeps drinking that whiskey and staring at the portrait of the master." "Whatever she wants with you, Solomon, tread carefully." The study was dimly lit by oil lamps when Solomon entered. Elizabeth sat in a high-backed chair, her face half in shadow. The Bible lay open on a small table beside her, and in her hand was the journal he had seen the previous day. "Lock the door," she instructed. Solomon hesitated, every instinct telling him not to trap himself in a room with an unpredictable white woman. In antebellum Alabama, such a scenario could easily become a death sentence for a black man, regardless of the truth. "I said lock it," Elizabeth repeated, her voice hardening. He complied, turning the key in the lock before standing awkwardly by the door, hands clasped before him. "Come closer and sit." She indicated a simple wooden chair positioned across from her. It was placed much closer than would normally be considered appropriate for an enslaved person to sit to their owner, especially a white woman. Solomon sat stiffly, keeping his eyes lowered. "Do you know why my husband favored you, Solomon?" Elizabeth asked, opening the journal to a blank page. "No, mistress. He said you had intelligent eyes, that when you looked at a person, you truly saw them." She picked up a pen. "Tonight I begin my confessions, and you will bear witness. But first I must ensure your silence." From a drawer, she produced a small silver dagger. Solomon tensed, ready to defend himself if necessary, though he knew resistance would mean certain death. Elizabeth noticed his reaction and smiled thinly. "I'm not going to harm you, not if you obey." She pricked her own finger with the dagger's tip, a drop of blood welling up against her pale skin. "In the old traditions, blood binds a covenant. Your mother was from Haiti, wasn't she?" Solomon was surprised she knew this detail. "Yes, mistress." "Then you understand blood oaths." She extended the dagger to him, handle first. "A drop of your blood mixed with mine, and our pact of silence is sealed." Every part of Solomon wanted to refuse, to run from this strange ritual that bordered on the very witchcraft Southern Christians so feared. But he had no choice. With trembling fingers, he took the dagger and pricked his thumb, allowing a drop of blood to fall onto the same spot as hers on the journal's first page. Elizabeth looked satisfied. "Now we begin." She took back the dagger, wiped it clean, and began to write in the journal. "My first confession is this. I have had thoughts of ending my own life." The bluntness of her statement startled Solomon. Suicide was considered a grave sin, one that condemned the soul to eternal damnation according to the Church. Since Charles died, I find myself staring at the laudanum bottle each night, wondering if I should simply drink it all and join him. She continued writing as she spoke. The shame of being a widow at my age, the whispers from society, the burden of running this plantation alone, it weighs on me like stones. Solomon remained silent, unsure if he was expected to respond. Do you judge me for these thoughts, Solomon? Elizabeth looked up from her writing, her eyes searching his. It is not my place to judge, Mistress. But if it were, what would the God you pray to say of such thoughts? Solomon considered carefully. I believe God understands suffering, Mistress. He suffered himself upon the cross. Something in Elizabeth's expression softened momentarily. A diplomatic answer. Perhaps that's why Charles trusted you. She returned to her writing. My second confession. I feel nothing for my husband's death. Not grief, not relief, simply nothing. What kind of woman feels nothing when her husband dies? The confession continued for over an hour, with Elizabeth revealing thoughts and feelings that would scandalize proper society. Her hatred of the social constraints placed upon women, her disdain for the neighboring plantation families and their hypocrisies, her resentment of the church and its teachings. Throughout it all, Solomon sat in uncomfortable silence, aware that each word she spoke placed him in greater danger. That's enough for tonight, Elizabeth finally declared, closing the journal and locking it in the desk drawer. Remember our blood oath, Solomon, not a word to anyone. Yes, Mistress. As he was escorted back to the slave quarters by a house servant, Solomon felt a weight settling over him. He had become the repository for a white woman's dangerous secrets, a position that could get him killed, regardless of whether he kept her confidences or betrayed them. Over the next 3 weeks, the nightly confessions continued. Elizabeth revealed increasingly troubling thoughts. Her fantasies of burning the plantation to the ground, her contempt for the institution of marriage, her questioning of religious doctrine. But never did she speak directly of her husband's death beyond her lack of grief for it. In the daytime, Solomon worked the fields as usual, though Overseer Williams seemed confused by the preferential treatment he was receiving, being called to the house each night, yet returning unharmed. The other enslaved people had begun to distance themselves from him, suspicious of his special status and fearful of being associated with whatever was happening. Only Margaret, an older woman who had been at Oak Haven longer than anyone else, dared to speak to him about it. Whatever that woman is doing with you, it ain't natural, Margaret whispered one evening as they ate their cornmeal. White women don't call on black men unless there's wickedness involved. You be careful, Solomon. Mistress Caldwell has the devil in her eyes since the master passed. Solomon wanted to confide in Margaret, to unburden himself of the weight of Elizabeth's confessions, but the memory of the blood oath and the very real threat to his life kept him silent. I'm being careful, was all he could offer in response. But as the days passed, Solomon began to notice changes in Elizabeth. The confessions seemed to be having an effect on her. She appeared less agitated, more focused. She had started eating again, according to Agnes, and had begun taking an interest in the plantation's affairs once more. Yet there was something calculating in her newfound composure that troubled Solomon deeply. On the 23rd night of confessions, everything changed. Solomon arrived at the study as usual, but found Elizabeth standing by the window instead of seated in her chair. The journal lay open on her desk, and beside it was a key that Solomon had never seen before. "Close the door, Solomon," she said without turning to look at him. He did as instructed, noting that she didn't ask him to lock it this time. "I've been thinking about freedom," Elizabeth said, still gazing out into the darkness. "What it means to truly be free. Do you think about freedom, Solomon?" It was a dangerous question. Any enslaved person admitting to thoughts of freedom could be accused of planning escape or rebellion. "I think all men wish to determine their own fates, Mistress." Elizabeth turned to face him, a strange smile playing on her lips. A careful answer, as always. She moved to the desk and picked up the journal. Tonight will be our final confession session. After this, everything changes. Solomon felt a chill run through him. Was she planning to kill him now that he had served his purpose? Was this final confession to be his last night on earth? "My final confession is this," Elizabeth said, her voice steady and clear. "I killed my husband, Charles Caldwell, on the night of February 12th, 1839. Solomon's breath caught in his throat. The confession he had been dreading had finally come, and with it, the knowledge that made him a liability she could not afford to keep alive. Elizabeth watched his reaction carefully, seemingly satisfied by the fear that flashed across his face. "You're not surprised," she noted. "You suspected as much, didn't you?" "It crossed my mind, Mistress," Solomon admitted, his eyes darting toward the door as he calculated his chances of escape. "Of course it did. You're intelligent, as Charles always said." Elizabeth ran her fingers along the edge of the journal. "Would you like to know how I did it? How I killed the man who owned this plantation, these lands, all these people, and me?" Solomon remained silent, aware that any response could be the wrong one. "Charles was not a kind man, despite what the neighboring families believed," Elizabeth continued, beginning to pace slowly across the study. "In public, he was charming, generous, a pillar of the community. But behind closed doors—" She paused, her knuckles whitening around the journal. "He had a temper and particular appetites." She pulled back the sleeve of her dress to reveal a series of faded bruises on her wrist. "These are the last marks he left on me. There were always marks somewhere, where proper society ladies wouldn't see them, of course. Charles was careful about that." Solomon kept his expression neutral, despite the sympathy he felt. He knew all too well about hidden bruises and the cruel hands of Master Caldwell. That night, he had been drinking heavily. He'd lost a significant sum in a business venture and was in a rage. "I knew what was coming. I'd endured it for 7 years of marriage." Elizabeth's voice had taken on a distant quality, as if she were reliving the memory. "But this time something in me simply broke. When he came at me, instead of cowering as I usually did, I grabbed the fire poker." She mimicked the motion, swinging an imaginary weapon. "The first blow caught him by surprise. He looked so shocked that I, his property in all but name, would dare to strike back. The second blow knocked him down, and the third—" She closed her eyes. "The third ensured he would never hurt me or anyone else again." The candlelight flickered across Elizabeth's face, casting strange shadows that made her appear almost ghoulish. Solomon remained frozen in his seat, knowing that every word she spoke bound them together in a conspiracy that could send both of them to the gallows, though his death would be far more brutal than hers. "Afterward, I cleaned up the blood myself. Couldn't risk even Agnes knowing. I dragged his body to the bed and arranged it to look as though he had died in his sleep. When I called for help the next morning, everyone assumed it was his heart. He had complained of chest pains before, and the doctor didn't look too closely. A prominent man, dead in his bed beside his grieving wife. Who would question it?" She looked directly at Solomon now. "But the truth has been eating at me. Hence our confessions. I needed someone to know, someone who couldn't tell or wouldn't be believed if they did." "Why tell me this, Mistress?" Solomon finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why risk your life by sharing this secret?" Elizabeth's smile returned, enigmatic and unsettling. "Because tonight, everything changes for both of us." She moved to the desk and picked up the key that had been lying there. "This is the key to the storeroom where Charles kept his most valuable possessions, including this." From a hidden pocket in her dress, she produced a folded document. "Do you know what this is?" Solomon shook his head, though a wild hope had begun to flicker in his chest. "This is a document of manumission, drawn up by Charles before his death. He occasionally freed slaves as acts of Christian charity, always making a grand public spectacle of his generosity." Her tone was bitter. He had prepared this one, but hadn't decided who would receive this particular blessing. Now I have decided. It's for you, Solomon. She extended the document toward him. Solomon stared at it, afraid to reach out, certain this must be some cruel trick. "Take it," Elizabeth insisted. "I've signed it and had it witnessed by Pastor Wilkins. He believes Charles signed it before his death. The pastor's eyesight isn't what it used to be, and Charles's signature was easy enough to forge." With trembling hands, Solomon took the document, unfolding it carefully. Though he could recognize some words, legal language was beyond his limited reading abilities. "It grants you your freedom, effective immediately," Elizabeth explained. "But there are conditions." Of course there would be conditions. Freedom never came without a price, especially when granted by those who had everything to lose from the truth. "You must leave Alabama tonight, and you can never return or contact anyone from Oak Haven again." Elizabeth's voice was firm. If you ever speak of our confessions or what I've told you tonight, I'll claim you stole the manumission papers. No one will believe your word against mine." "Why?" Solomon finally managed to ask. "Why free me?" Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, studying him with those unsettling eyes. "Because you're the only person who knows what I am, what I'm capable of, and strangely, that gives me a kind of peace." She returned to the window, looking out at the dark plantation grounds. "Perhaps I also want someone to escape this place, to know that at least one person got away from Oak Haven." She turned back to face him. "In the storeroom you'll find a bag with provisions, clothes that will help you pass as a free man, and $50. It's enough to get you north if you're careful. The key to the stables is there too. Take the bay gelding. By the time they discover it missing, you should be well away." Solomon clutched the manumission papers, still unable to believe this sudden turn of events. "The others will be punished when I'm discovered missing." "No, they won't." Elizabeth's voice was calm, confident. "I've already planned for that. Tomorrow morning I'll discover a break-in at the storeroom. I'll claim an unknown thief took the horse and some valuables. No one will connect it to you. As far as they'll know, you'll have been sold to a plantation in Mississippi. I've already created the false bill of sale." The thoroughness of her planning was chilling. How long had she been preparing this? And why go to such lengths for him? As if reading his thoughts, Elizabeth added, "Consider it payment for your services as my confessor. You've absolved me in your way, and now I'm freeing you in mine." Solomon stood slowly, still gripping the document. "If this is a trap—" "It's not." Elizabeth cut him off. "I'm many things, Solomon, but I'm not a liar. Not about this. Charles' death has granted me a certain freedom, and now I'm granting you yours. Perhaps it's the only truly good thing I'll ever do." She moved to the desk and unlocked the drawer, removing the confession journal. "One last thing before you go." She held the journal out to him. "Take this with you. Burn it when you're safely away from here. Let my sins turn to ash and scatter to the winds." Solomon took the journal, tucking it inside his shirt along with the manumission papers. The weight of both against his chest felt like both a burden and a promise. "Agnes will escort you to the storeroom. She knows only that I've tasked you with retrieving something for me. She doesn't know what's really happening." Elizabeth moved to the door and unlocked it. "This is goodbye, Solomon Thomas. I doubt our paths will ever cross again." "What will happen to you?" The question surprised even Solomon himself. Why should he care about the fate of this woman? A murderer, a slave owner, his oppressor. A hint of genuine emotion finally crossed Elizabeth's face, something like regret mixed with resignation. "I'll continue to play my role, the grieving widow who manages her plantation with surprising skill. Perhaps in time I'll remarry, find a husband who's easier to control than Charles was, or perhaps I'll sell this place and move somewhere no one knows me." She shrugged slightly. "Either way, I'll survive. I always do." She opened the door and called softly for Agnes. The older woman appeared quickly, her expression curious but controlled. "Agnes, escort Solomon to the storeroom. He's to retrieve a package for me and then return to his quarters. No one is to disturb him, understood?" "Yes, mistress," Agnes replied, though her eyes darted suspiciously between Elizabeth and Solomon. As Solomon followed Agnes down the hallway, he could feel Elizabeth watching him. He didn't look back. If this was indeed his path to freedom, he wouldn't waste a moment of it on farewells to the place that had held him captive for his entire life. The storeroom was as Elizabeth had described. A canvas sack contained clothes too fine for any slave to wear without raising suspicion, provisions that would last several days, and a small pouch containing $50. More money than Solomon had ever seen in his life. The key to the stables lay atop the provisions, along with a folded map with a route marked in red ink. "What's all this?" Agnes whispered, her eyes wide as she saw the contents of the bag. "Nothing you need concern yourself with," Solomon replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Go back to the house, Agnes. It's better if you don't know more." Something in his tone must have convinced her, for she nodded slowly. "Whatever you're doing, Solomon, be careful." She squeezed his arm briefly before turning and walking back toward the main house, her shoulders tense with unasked questions. Once alone, Solomon quickly changed into the provided clothes, plain but well-made trousers, a cotton shirt, sturdy boots, and a wool coat that would serve him well as he traveled north. He tucked the money, map, manumission papers, and journal securely inside the coat, then slung the provision bag over his shoulder. The stables were dark and quiet when he arrived. Working quickly and silently, skills honed from years of avoiding the overseer's attention, Solomon saddled the bay gelding. The horse was one of the plantation's best, not the flashiest, which would draw attention, but strong and with good endurance. As he led the horse out of the stable, Solomon paused and looked back at Oak Haven. The white columns of the main house glowed faintly in the moonlight, a sight that had represented oppression for his entire life. For a moment, he thought he could see a figure standing at one of the upstairs windows, Elizabeth watching his departure, but perhaps it was just a trick of the light and shadow. With a silent prayer for those he was leaving behind, Solomon mounted the horse and urged it forward, away from the plantation and toward the North Star that had guided so many before him. Freedom lay ahead, purchased with blood and secrets. It wasn't the path he would have chosen, but it was the one offered to him, and he would not refuse it. As Oak Haven faded into the distance behind him, Solomon felt the weight of the confession journal against his chest. He carried Elizabeth Caldwell's sins with him into the night, a dark bargain that had granted him the most precious gift of all, his liberty. The first few miles passed in tense silence as Solomon kept to the shadows, avoiding the main roads where patrols might question a black man riding alone at night, even one with papers. The map Elizabeth had provided marked a route following creek beds and wooded paths, clearly designed to avoid populated areas. By dawn, Solomon had put nearly 20 miles between himself and Oak Haven. He found a secluded spot in a dense copse of trees to rest the horse and himself. As the first light filtered through the leaves, he finally allowed himself to fully examine the manumission papers by daylight. The document appeared official, with all the proper seals and signatures. If Elizabeth had forged her husband's signature, she had done it skillfully. The paper stated that the Negro man, known as Solomon Thomas, aged approximately 32 years, was granted his freedom in recognition of faithful service and as an act of Christian charity. Solomon's hands trembled as he read the words that legally transformed him from property to person. Though he had been a man in God's eyes, and his own all along in the eyes of the law, this piece of paper was what made him human. As he tucked the document away again, his fingers brushed against Elizabeth's confession journal. Curiosity overcame his caution, and he opened it to read what she had written during their sessions. The pages contained not only the confessions she had spoken aloud to him, but deeper, more disturbing thoughts she had kept to herself. Elizabeth wrote of her hatred for the society that had trapped her in marriage to a cruel man, of her growing resentment toward the institution of slavery, even as she continued to benefit from it, and finally, in explicit detail, how she had planned and executed her husband's murder. March 15th, 1839. The final entry read, "Tonight I will tell Solomon everything and set him free. His freedom is my true confession, an admission that this system we have built is evil. One man's liberty does not atone for my sins, but perhaps it is a start. I wonder if God is watching. I wonder if he cares." Solomon closed the journal, deeply troubled. Elizabeth Caldwell was a complex woman, a murderer and an oppressor who had nonetheless granted him his freedom. Was it guilt that motivated her? Some twisted form of redemption, or simply a desire to share her burden with someone who would carry it far away from Oak Haven? It didn't matter now. What mattered was that he was free and had to ensure his freedom lasted. Solomon knew that despite his manumission papers, he would face suspicion and danger at every turn. A black man traveling alone was always subject to scrutiny, and if Elizabeth's plan was discovered or fell apart, he would be hunted as both a runaway slave and an accessory to murder. After allowing the horse a few more hours of rest, Solomon continued his journey northward. The map indicated a small settlement about 10 miles ahead, where the Underground Railroad had a contact, a Quaker shopkeeper who could provide shelter and guidance for the next leg of his journey. As he rode, Solomon considered the other enslaved people he had left behind at Oak Haven, Margaret, who had been like a second mother to him. Young James, barely 16 and already scarred from the overseer's whip. Agnes, who had always slipped extra food to the field hands when she could. Had he betrayed them by accepting his own freedom while they remained in bondage? But what choice did he have? To refuse Elizabeth's offer would have meant certain death once she had confessed her crime to him. At least this way, he might eventually find a way to help others, perhaps by joining the growing abolitionist movement in the North. The small town came into view by mid-afternoon. Following the instructions on the map, Solomon approached a modest general store on the outskirts of the settlement. He tethered his horse at a post some distance away and proceeded on foot, the manumission papers clutched in his hand like a shield. A bell jingled as he entered the store. An older white man with a grey beard looked up from behind the counter, his expression carefully neutral as he assessed Solomon. "Good day," the man said evenly. "What brings you to these parts, friend?" Solomon recognized the cautious tone, neither welcoming nor hostile, waiting to determine if this black visitor was truly free or a runaway. "I seek rest for my journey," Solomon replied, using the phrase Elizabeth had written on the map. "The road is long to where I'm bound." The man's expression softened slightly. "Indeed it is. And where might that be?" "North," Solomon said simply, placing his manumission papers on the counter. "I have my papers, sir." The shopkeeper, who introduced himself only as Friend Thomas, examined the documents carefully. "These appear to be in order," he said finally, returning them to Solomon. "Though I find it curious that a man newly freed would be traveling alone on plantation business, as your presence here suggests." Solomon hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "My former mistress arranged my freedom following her husband's death. The circumstances were unusual." Friend Thomas studied him for a long moment. "I see. Well, unusual circumstances often lead to unusual journeys." He lowered his voice. "You can rest in the back room until nightfall. Then my son will guide you to the next station. It's safer to travel after dark." As Solomon followed the shopkeeper to a small room behind the store, he felt both profound gratitude and nagging suspicion. What if this man wasn't truly part of the Underground Railroad? What if Elizabeth's map had led him into a trap? But his fears proved unfounded. Friend Thomas provided a simple meal and fresh water, asking few questions and offering practical advice for the journey ahead. "The papers will help, but they won't protect you everywhere," the Quaker warned. "Some won't bother to read them, and others won't care what they say. Trust is a luxury few can afford in these times." As dusk fell, Solomon prepared to continue his journey. Before leaving, he took out Elizabeth's confession journal and showed it to friend Thomas. "I need to destroy this," he explained, not revealing the contents. "It could be dangerous if found." The shopkeeper nodded, understanding the need for destroyed evidence without asking for details. He led Solomon to the back of the store, where a small stove burned. "Whatever burden that book represents," friend Thomas said, "let it end here." Solomon opened the journal to the first page, where their blood, his and Elizabeth's, had mingled to seal their pact. He tore out this page and tucked it into his coat pocket, then fed the rest of the journal into the flames, watching as Elizabeth Caldwell's confessions turned to ash. As he watched the pages curl and blacken, Solomon reflected on the strange path that had led him to this moment. A white woman's crime had purchased his freedom, and her sins were now literally turning to smoke before his eyes. Was he complicit in her evil by accepting this bargain? Or was he simply seizing the opportunity for liberty by any means necessary? The question had no easy answer, and Solomon suspected it would haunt him for years to come. But as the last page of the journal disintegrated into the flames, he made a silent vow. His freedom, bought at such a strange and terrible price, would not be wasted. Somehow, someday, he would find a way to help others escape the bonds he had left behind. When night fully fell, friend Thomas's son, a solemn young man named Isaac, appeared to guide Solomon to the next station on the Underground Railroad. With the confession journal destroyed, and only the blood-stained first page as a reminder of his unusual pact, Solomon continued his journey toward a future unknown, but free. What he didn't know was that back at Oak Haven, events were already unfolding that would send ripples along his path to freedom, threatening to drag him back into the darkness he was trying to escape. The morning after Solomon's departure, Oak Haven Plantation erupted in controlled chaos. Elizabeth Caldwell, dressed in her nightclothes and with her hair artfully disheveled, stood in the doorway of the ransacked storeroom, playing the role of the distressed mistress to perfection. "How could this happen?" she demanded of Overseer Williams, who surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes. "Right under our noses. What do we pay you for, if not to prevent such violations?" Williams, a brutal man but not an entirely stupid one, frowned as he examined the scattered contents of the storeroom. "No ordinary thief would know where to find the valuables, Mistress Caldwell. This was someone familiar with the plantation." Elizabeth's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine alarm. "Are you suggesting one of our people did this? One of our slaves? Or perhaps one of the house servants?" Williams suggested, his gaze lingering on Agnes, who stood in the background, her expression carefully blank. "Someone who would know your routines, when the house would be quiet." "Preposterous," Elizabeth declared, though a touch of uncertainty had entered her voice, a masterful addition to her performance. "Our people are loyal. It must have been an outsider, perhaps with help from someone on a neighboring plantation." She turned to the small gathering of house slaves who had assembled to witness the commotion. "Has anyone seen anything unusual? Noticed anyone missing?" A moment of tense silence followed. Agnes stepped forward hesitantly. "Solomon isn't in the fields today, Mistress. No one has seen him since last night." Elizabeth's brow furrowed with apparent confusion. "Solomon? But that's impossible. I sent him on an errand yesterday. He's been sold to the Wilkinson plantation in Mississippi. The buyer's man was to collect him last night." She turned to Williams. "Wasn't that arranged?" The overseer looked startled. I wasn't informed of any sale, Mistress." "I left the papers on my husband's desk," Elizabeth said, a note of irritation entering her voice. "The bill of sale clearly stated—" She stopped suddenly. "Unless— Oh my God, could Solomon have been involved in this? Could he have seen the papers and realized he was being sold?" The suggestion hung in the air, creating exactly the effect Elizabeth had intended. Williams straightened, his expression hardening with purpose now that he had a clear suspect. That must be it. The boy learned he was being sold and decided to take what he could before running. But Solomon wouldn't, Agnes began, only to be silenced by a sharp look from Elizabeth. Search the quarters, the outbuildings everywhere, Elizabeth commanded. He can't have gone far, and send word to the neighboring plantations and the sheriff. Offer a reward for his capture. She pressed a hand to her forehead as if overwhelmed. To think that Solomon, of all people, would betray us this way. As the search party dispersed, Agnes remained behind, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth with a mixture of suspicion and fear. When they were alone, she spoke softly but directly. "Solomon didn't steal anything, did he, Mistress?" Elizabeth stiffened. "What are you suggesting, Agnes? Be very careful with your next words." "And I saw what was in that bag last night," Agnes continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Those weren't things a man would take if he was stealing. Those were provisions for a journey." For a moment, Elizabeth's carefully constructed facade wavered. Then she stepped closer to Agnes, her voice dropping to match the other woman's whisper. "What you think you saw is irrelevant. Solomon has run away after stealing from this household. That is what happened. Do you understand me?" Agnes held her gaze for a long moment before lowering her eyes. "Yes, Mistress, I understand." "Good. Because if any other version of events were to circulate, I would have to assume you were complicit in his theft and escape, and you know what happens to slaves who aid runaways." The threat hung in the air between them, as tangible as the humid Alabama morning. Agnes nodded once, then turned and left the storeroom, her back straight with dignity, despite the fear Elizabeth knew must be coursing through her. Alone now, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of doubt. The plan had been set in motion and could not be stopped. Solomon was free, or at least he had been given the chance at freedom. Whether he would successfully navigate the dangerous path ahead remained to be seen. And now she had Agnes to worry about, a potential loose thread that could unravel everything. She straightened her nightdress and composed her features once more. The role of the betrayed mistress would need to be played perfectly in the days ahead if Solomon's escape and her own secrets were to remain secure. Miles away, unaware of the drama unfolding at Oak Haven, Solomon continued his journey northward under the guidance of Isaac, the Quaker's son. They traveled by night, keeping to less used paths and communicating in hushed tones. By dawn, they had reached the next station, a modest farm owned by a German immigrant family named Müller. Frau Müller, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, ushered Solomon into a hidden cellar beneath their barn, while Isaac departed with a silent nod, returning to his father's store before his absence could be noted. "You rest now," Frau Müller told Solomon in accented English. "Tonight, my husband will take you to the river crossing." Solomon sank onto the simple cot provided, exhaustion from the tense journey catching up with him. But despite his fatigue, sleep eluded him. Every creak and rustle from above sent his heart racing, imagining slave catchers descending upon his hiding place. To calm his mind, he took out the manumission papers and read them again, tracing the words that declared him legally free. Then he removed the single page he had saved from Elizabeth's journal, the one stained with their mingled blood. In the dim light filtering through the cellar's small air vents, the brownish stain looked almost black against the paper. Why had he kept it? Solomon wasn't entirely sure. Perhaps as insurance, proof of Elizabeth's crime, should he ever need leverage. Or perhaps as a reminder of the strange pact that had granted him his liberty, freedom purchased with blood and silence. He had just tucked the papers away when a commotion erupted above. Voices, footsteps, the sound of doors being thrown open. Solomon froze, straining to hear. "Have no right to search our property without cause," came Herr Müller's voice, firm but with an undercurrent of fear. "We have reports of a runaway slave in the area," replied another voice, unfamiliar, authoritative. "Stolen a horse and valuables from his mistress down in Alabama. Sheriffs deputized us to search all properties in the county." Solomon's blood ran cold. They were looking for him specifically. How had they tracked him this far, this quickly? "We have no slaves here." Frau Müller's voice joined her husband's. We do not believe in such things, which is exactly why runaways might seek shelter with German folk like yourselves, the man replied, his tone now openly suspicious. Now step aside or face charges of obstruction. Heavy footsteps moved across the barn floor above Solomon's head. He looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the cellar offered no further concealment. The trapdoor was well hidden beneath hay and farm equipment, but a thorough search would surely discover it. Solomon clutched his manumission papers. If found, they might offer legal protection, but only if the slave catchers bothered to read them, and only if they believed them to be genuine. Many free black people had been kidnapped and sold into slavery despite having legitimate papers, their protestations ignored by those who profited from their captivity. The footsteps paused directly overhead. Solomon held his breath, every muscle tensed for flight or fight, though he knew either would likely end in his capture or death. A long moment passed. Then, miraculously, the footsteps moved away, continuing their search elsewhere in the barn. "Nothing here," the man called out eventually, "but we'll be watching you, Muller, Germans and their abolitionist ideas." The threat remained unfinished but clear. More footsteps, receding now, followed by the sound of horses riding away. Still, Solomon didn't move, fearful this might be a trick to flush him out. Only when Herr Müller carefully opened the trapdoor an hour later did Solomon release the breath he felt he'd been holding since the search began. "They are gone for now," the German farmer said, his face grave, "but they will return. It is not safe for you to stay until nightfall, as planned." "They're looking for me specifically," Solomon said, climbing out of the cellar. "How could they know I've come this way?" Müller shook his head. "Someone must have informed them, perhaps at the last place you stayed." "Friend Thomas?" Solomon couldn't believe the Quaker shopkeeper would betray him. "No, he's part of the Underground Railroad. He wouldn't. Not willingly, perhaps. But if pressured—" Müller didn't finish the thought. "Regardless, we must get you moving immediately. The river crossing is still 10 miles north. If you can make it there, the next conductor can hide you more securely until the search dies down." Frau Müller appeared with a bundle of food and a battered hat. "Wear this. Keep to the woods along the eastern bank. Herr Schmidt will be waiting in a blue boat. The password is Freedom's Shore." Solomon nodded gratefully, taking the provisions. "Thank you for the risk you've taken. I won't forget it." "Go with God," Frau Müller replied simply, "and may he blind the eyes of those who hunt you." With that blessing, Solomon slipped out the back of the barn and into the adjacent woods, moving as quickly and quietly as his exhausted body would allow. The midday sun made him feel exposed even beneath the canopy of trees, but waiting until dark would mean another night at the Müllers, a risk he couldn't ask them to take. As he made his way northward, keeping the small river to his left as instructed, Solomon's mind raced with questions. How had the slave catchers tracked him? Had Elizabeth's plan somehow failed? Or worse, had it never been genuine to begin with? Was this all an elaborate trap, allowing him to believe he was free, only to recapture him as a runaway, justifying an even more severe punishment? No, that made no sense. Elizabeth had given him legitimate manumission papers. She had confessed to murder in her journal, which she could never risk having discovered. The blood oath page he still carried was evidence that could send her to the gallows. Whatever else she might be, Elizabeth Caldwell wasn't reckless enough to create such evidence as part of a mere charade. Which meant someone else had recognized him, or the horse, or had somehow pieced together his escape route. The net was tightening around him, and Solomon knew that his newfound freedom hung by the thinnest of threads. By late afternoon, Solomon's pace had slowed considerably. Lack of sleep and the constant stress of potential discovery had drained his energy. But the river had widened, suggesting he was nearing the crossing point described by the Müllers. He scanned the water for any sign of a blue boat or Herr Schmidt. Instead, what he saw made his heart sink. 2 men on horseback were patrolling the opposite bank, rifles clearly visible across their saddles. slave catchers waiting at the very crossing he needed to use. Solomon retreated deeper into the woods, mind racing. Had the entire underground railroad network in this area been compromised? How else could they know to wait at this specific crossing point? As dusk approached, Solomon found a hollow beneath the exposed roots of a large oak tree and concealed himself as best he could. He needed to rest and think. The crossing was being watched. Returning to the Mullers was too dangerous, and continuing along this bank would eventually lead him to more populated areas where a black man traveling alone would immediately draw suspicion. He was contemplating these limited options when a sound made him freeze, footsteps moving deliberately through the underbrush nearby. Solomon held his breath, pressing himself deeper into the hollow, one hand instinctively reaching for the small knife he carried. The footsteps paused, uncomfortably close to his hiding place. Then a voice called out softly, "Freedom's Shore," the password. Solomon remained silent, suspicious of a trap. "I know you're near," the voice continued, still quiet but urgent. "I'm Herr Schmidt's son. The crossing's been compromised. Father sent me to find you before they do." Still, Solomon hesitated until the stranger added, "The Mullers said you carried papers, manumission from Alabama. Is this true?" "Yes," Solomon replied finally, emerging cautiously from his hiding place. The speaker was a young white man, perhaps 20, with a shock of blonde hair partially hidden under a cap. "Show me," the young man demanded, keeping a wary distance. Solomon produced the papers, holding them where they could be read but not easily snatched. The young man, who introduced himself simply as Carl, nodded after examining them from a respectful distance. These looked genuine, unusual though for someone from so far south to be traveling alone with fresh manumission papers. "It's a long story," Solomon replied, unwilling to share Elizabeth's secrets with yet another stranger. Carl seemed to accept this. "We haven't much time. The regular crossing is being watched, but I know another way, a few miles upstream. We must hurry. They'll search the woods again at dawn." With few alternatives, Solomon followed Carl through the deepening twilight. The young man moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the landscape, occasionally pausing to ensure they weren't being followed. "How did they know?" Solomon asked as they walked. "About the crossing? About me?" Carl's expression darkened. "Someone betrayed us. 3 days ago, slave catchers raided friend Thomas's store. They took his son, Isaac." Solomon felt as if he'd been struck. Isaac, the solemn young man who had guided him to the Mullers. "Is he alive?" last we heard, but they're questioning him. The way Carl said the word made it clear what kind of questioning was taking place. "He's strong, but everyone breaks eventually. That's why we're moving all current travelers off the established routes." Guilt washed over Solomon. Isaac was suffering because of him, because of the help he had provided. Another price paid for his freedom, another blood debt accruing interest. They reached the alternative crossing point as true darkness fell. A small rowboat was hidden among the reeds, barely visible in the moonlight. "I'll row you across," Carl whispered. "On the other side, head northeast until you reach a white church with a broken bell tower. Ask for Sister Martha. She'll guide you to the next station." As they silently crossed the dark water, Solomon's thoughts returned to Oak Haven and Elizabeth Caldwell. What was happening there now? Had his absence been discovered? Was Agnes safe, or had suspicion fallen on her as well? The blood-stained journal page seemed to burn in his pocket, a talisman of his unusual bond with Elizabeth and a reminder of how their fates remained intertwined despite the growing distance between them. What Solomon couldn't know was that at that very moment, back at Oak Haven Plantation, Elizabeth Caldwell was fighting her own battle to maintain the fiction she had created, a battle that was rapidly spiraling beyond her control. The initial search for Solomon had expanded, with plantation owners from 3 counties joining forces to hunt down the dangerous runaway who had allegedly attacked his mistress before fleeing with stolen property. This embellishment to the story hadn't come from Elizabeth, but from Overseer Williams, eager to justify a brutal response when Solomon was captured. Elizabeth had been forced to go along with the escalating narrative, each lie building upon the previous, until she found herself at the center of a manhunt far larger than she had anticipated. Local newspapers had picked up the story, portraying her as a defenseless widow victimized by an ungrateful slave she had treated with particular kindness. "I'd never thought Solomon capable of such betrayal," she told the gathered plantation owners in her drawing room, playing the role of the wounded benefactress to perfection. "After my husband's death, I relied on him more than was perhaps wise." "These educated ones are always the most dangerous," opined Mr. Bradford, owner of the neighboring plantation. "Reading puts ideas in their heads. Makes them forget their place." Elizabeth nodded as expected, though the irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She had deliberately set Solomon free, provided him with the means to escape, and now she was actively participating in the performance of hunting him down, all while knowing he carried evidence that could destroy her. The real complication had come that morning, when Sheriff Davis had arrived at Oak Haven with disturbing news. "Mistress Caldwell," he'd said, removing his hat as he entered her parlor, "I'm afraid I must ask you some difficult questions about your husband's death." Elizabeth had felt a chill run through her, though her expression remained composed. "Charles, but he died of natural causes months ago. What questions could possibly remain?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we've received an anonymous letter suggesting foul play might have been involved. Normally I'd dismiss such things as malicious gossip, but with your slave running away and now this letter," he left the implication hanging. "That's absurd," Elizabeth had replied, her mind racing to identify who could have sent such a letter, who would make such an accusation. "The letter was unsigned, ma'am, but it suggested that your slave, Solomon, might have knowledge of the circumstances surrounding your husband's death, which makes his sudden disappearance concerning." And there it was, the trap closing around her. Someone suspected her, someone who knew Solomon had been her confidant. Agnes, one of the other house slaves who had noticed their nightly meetings? Or was it merely a fortuitous coincidence, someone with a grudge against her capitalizing on Solomon's disappearance to cast suspicion? Either way, the situation had become infinitely more dangerous. Now, Solomon wasn't just a runaway slave, but a potential witness to murder. If caught, he would be interrogated mercilessly, and the manumission papers, her protection against his testimony, might not be enough to save him or silence him. Elizabeth had maintained her composure through the sheriff's questioning, expressing appropriate outrage at the anonymous accusations. But once alone, she had allowed herself a moment of genuine fear. Her carefully constructed plan was unraveling, and Solomon's recapture now threatened not just his freedom, but her very life. As darkness fell over Oak Haven that night, Elizabeth made a decision. The search for Solomon had to fail. Somehow, she needed to ensure that the man who carried her confession never fell into the hands of those who would force him to reveal it. In the drawing room, she penned a letter to be delivered to various search parties, offering an additional reward for Solomon's capture. But in the privacy of her bedroom, she wrote a different letter, one that would find its way into the Underground Railroad network, warning them that the runaway known as Solomon Thomas was in grave danger and must be moved north with all possible haste. It was a desperate gamble, but Elizabeth had already committed the ultimate crime. What was one more sin in the service of survival? As she sealed the second letter, destined for a sympathetic Quaker merchant in the nearest town who was rumored to have abolitionist ties, Elizabeth whispered a strange prayer into the darkness of her room. "God protect him, not for his sake, but for mine." Unknown to Elizabeth, her prayer would be tested sooner than she imagined. For Solomon, having crossed the river with Carl's help, was walking into a situation more dangerous than any he had faced thus far on his journey to freedom. The white church with the broken bell tower appeared as a ghostly silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Solomon, exhausted from travelling through the night, approached cautiously, remembering Carl's instructions to ask for Sister Martha. The church itself appeared abandoned, its windows dark and its wooden doors weathered by years of neglect. But behind it, a small cottage showed signs of habitation, a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney, a neatly tended garden at its side. Solomon hesitated at the cottage door, uncertain whether to knock so early in the morning. Before he could decide, the door opened to reveal an elderly white woman, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes sharp as they assessed him. "You're the one from Alabama," she said, her voice low and firm. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am, I was told to ask for Sister Martha." The woman nodded once. "I am Martha. Come inside quickly. Eyes are everywhere these days." And the cottage interior was simple but comfortable, a stark contrast to the slave quarters Solomon had known all his life. Sister Martha gestured for him to sit at a small table while she poured a cup of weak coffee and placed a plate of cornbread before him. "Eat," she instructed, "then we'll discuss your situation. Carl sent word ahead that the regular crossing was compromised." Solomon ate gratefully, the warm food and drink reviving his spirits somewhat. As he finished, Sister Martha sat across from him, her expression grave. "The network has been damaged," she explained without preamble. 3 stations discovered, 2 conductors arrested, and several travelers recaptured. Someone is betraying us, but we haven't identified who. Solomon felt a fresh wave of guilt. "I heard about Isaac. He helped me reach the mullahs." Martha's lips tightened. "Yes, he hasn't broken yet, but it's only a matter of time. The movement is relocating all current travelers off known routes." "Where will I go now?" Solomon asked, fighting against the despair threatening to overwhelm him. So close to freedom, yet still so far. "North still," Martha replied, "but by a different path. One less travelled and more dangerous, but less likely to be compromised." She studied him for a moment. "You have papers." Solomon produced his manumission document. Martha examined it carefully, her expression revealing nothing. "Unusual circumstances," she noted, handing it back to him. "But it appears legitimate. This changes things. With valid papers, you could potentially travel openly, at least in some areas." "The papers haven't protected me so far," Solomon pointed out. "The search parties are calling me a runaway regardless." Martha nodded grimly. "Because someone wants you caught badly enough to lie about your status. The question is why." Solomon's hand instinctively moved to his coat pocket, where the blood-stained journal page rested. The physical evidence of Elizabeth's crime and their strange pact. Should he tell this woman the truth? Could he trust her with Elizabeth's secret, and by extension his own? Before he could decide, a rapid knocking at the door made them both freeze. Martha motioned for Solomon to hide in a small pantry off the kitchen while she answered. Through the partially open pantry door, Solomon could see a young boy, no more than 12, his face flushed from running. "Riders coming, Sister Martha," the boy panted. 6 men with dogs, asking about a runaway from Alabama. They're checking every house in the valley." Martha's expression remained calm, though her voice took on an edge. "How long?" 10 minutes, maybe less. They were at the Miller place when I left." She pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "Good lad. Now go home, take the back path. If anyone asks, you were collecting herbs for your mother." As the boy disappeared, Martha turned toward the pantry. "There's no time to move you to another location. The cellar isn't safe. It's the first place they'll check." Solomon emerged, his mind racing. "I have my papers, which they'll likely ignore or destroy." Martha cut him off. "No, we need another solution." She thought for a moment, then moved decisively to a chest in the corner of the room. From it, She withdrew a black dress, white collar, and a worn Bible. "Put these on over your clothes," she instructed, handing him the clerical garments. "You'll pose as Reverend Thomas, a visiting preacher from Philadelphia. Your papers will support that you're a free man." Solomon stared at the clothing in shock. "They'll never believe—" "They must," Martha said firmly. "I know it's a risk, but there are free black preachers in the North. It's our only chance." She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. "Can you read scripture?" "Yes," Solomon replied, thinking of the secret lessons from his mother and the Bible passages he had committed to memory. "Good. Follow my lead, speak as little as possible, and remember, you are a man of God who commands respect. Believe it yourself, and they may believe it too." With shaking hands, Solomon donned the clerical collar and black coat. The transformation was strange, these simple garments conferring a dignity and authority he had never been permitted to claim. Martha assessed him critically, then nodded once. "Now we pray this works." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the sound of horses and men's voices carried from the road. Dogs bayed in the distance, and Solomon felt sweat break out across his forehead despite the morning chill. "Steady," Martha murmured, arranging an open Bible on the table between them. "We were discussing tomorrow's sermon. You've been staying here 3 days already." The pounding at the door was expected, but still made Solomon flinch. Martha squeezed his arm reassuringly before going to answer it. 3 men stood on her doorstep, dust-covered and grim-faced. The apparent leader, a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest, addressed Martha with forced politeness. "Sister Martha, we're searching for a runaway slave from Alabama. Dangerous fellow, attacked his mistress before fleeing with stolen property. Trail leads this direction." Martha's expression registered appropriate concern. "How dreadful. But I've seen no such person, Deputy Harris." The deputy's eyes moved past her to where Solomon sat at the table, the Bible open before him. Suspicion flared immediately. "And who might this be?" he asked, his hand moving to rest on his pistol. Martha stepped aside, allowing the men a clear view. "This is Reverend Thomas from Philadelphia. He's been staying with me these past 3 days while visiting our congregation." Solomon rose slowly, forcing himself to meet the deputy's gaze with a calm dignity that belied the terror coursing through him. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, keeping his voice steady and measured, as he imagined a northern preacher might speak. Deputy Harris narrowed his eyes. "A colored preacher, all the way from Philadelphia? That's mighty convenient timing, wouldn't you say, Sister Martha?" "The Lord's timing often is," Martha replied serenely. "Reverend Thomas arrived Thursday last. Ask anyone in the congregation." The deputy wasn't satisfied. "Papers," he demanded, addressing Solomon directly now. "Let's see your free papers, Reverend." Solomon reached into his coat and produced the manumission document, praying the men wouldn't look too closely at its origin or recent date. The deputy snatched it from him and examined it with obvious skepticism. "Signed by a Charles Caldwell of Oak Haven Plantation, Alabama," he read aloud. His head snapped up, eyes boring into Solomon's. "The same plantation our runaway is from." Solomon's heart sank, but he maintained his composure. "Yes, Master Caldwell freed me before his passing, God rest his soul. I've since found my calling in the ministry up north." The deputy glanced at his companions, who had moved to flank Solomon. "Strange coincidence, wouldn't you say? A free man from the very plantation where a slave went missing, turning up here just as we're tracking said runaway." "I assure you, there's no connection," Solomon replied, desperately channeling the calm authority he'd observed in white preachers. "I've been in Philadelphia these past 6 months. Sister Martha and several members of her congregation can attest to my presence here since Thursday." It was a dangerous claim, one that could easily be disproven if they questioned others in the area. But Solomon was counting on Martha's standing in the community and the hesitation these men might feel at directly challenging a man of the cloth, even a black one. Deputy Harris wasn't fully convinced, but his certainty appeared to waver. "You understand we need to be thorough," he said, handing the papers back to Solomon with obvious reluctance. "This runaway is dangerous. Attacked his mistress, Elizabeth Caldwell, before fleeing. She's offering a substantial reward for his capture." Solomon felt a chill at the mention of Elizabeth being attacked, a detail that hadn't been in her original plan. The situation at Oakhaven must have evolved in dangerous ways since his departure. "I shall pray for Mrs. Caldwell's recovery and for justice to be served," Solomon replied, infusing his voice with appropriate concern. "Violence is never the Lord's way." Sister Martha stepped forward. "Deputy, I understand you must do your duty, but I can personally vouch for Reverend Thomas's presence here. Furthermore, he's scheduled to deliver the sermon tomorrow morning. Perhaps you and your men would like to attend. I'm sure the congregation would welcome your presence. It was a masterful challenge, both an invitation and a public test of their willingness to show respect to a black preacher." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "That won't be necessary, but we still need to search the premises if you don't mind." Martha gestured expansively. "Of course. Though I assure you, there's no one here but the Reverend and myself." The next 30 minutes were among the most tense of Solomon's life. He remained seated at the table, ostensibly returning to his sermon preparation, while the men searched the cottage thoroughly. They examined the cellar, checked the attic, and even looked under beds and in wardrobes. Their dogs sniffed around the property but found nothing unusual. Solomon's scent was throughout the cottage, but that was easily explained by his supposed 3-day stay. Finally, finding nothing suspicious, Deputy Harris and his men prepared to leave. At the door, the deputy turned back, his eyes lingering on Solomon one last time. "If you do happen to encounter anyone matching the runaway's description, tall, well-built, speaks better than most of his kind, I trust you'll send word immediately. Even a man of God must uphold the law." "Of course," Martha assured him. "We are law-abiding citizens, after all." Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Martha close the door and lean against it, releasing a long breath. That was too close. Solomon's legs felt suddenly weak, and he sank back into his chair. "They said Elizabeth was attacked. That wasn't part of the plan." Martha raised an eyebrow. "Plan? So there is more to your story than simple manumission." Solomon hesitated, then slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew the blood-stained page from Elizabeth's confession journal. The time had come for complete honesty. His survival might depend on this woman understanding exactly what was at stake. "My former mistress, Elizabeth Caldwell, killed her husband," he said quietly. "She confessed this to me over many nights, wrote it in a journal, then granted me my freedom in exchange for my silence." Martha's eyes widened as she took in the implications. "And now she's claiming you attacked her and ran away? Why would she betray you after freeing you?" "I don't think she did," Solomon replied, thinking aloud. "The story has changed from what she planned. She told me she would claim there was a break-in, that I had been sold to Mississippi. Something must have happened to force her to change the narrative." Martha studied the blood-stained page Solomon had handed her, her expression grave. "This is a dangerous secret to carry, young man. If this woman confessed murder to you, your life will never be safe, as long as she fears exposure." "The rest of the journal was destroyed," Solomon explained. "This page is the only physical evidence left, our blood oath. Without it, it's her word against mine. And who would believe a black man accusing a white woman of murder?" "No one," Martha agreed grimly, "which is precisely why the search for you is so aggressive. It's not about a runaway slave or stolen property, it's about silencing a witness." The reality of his situation hit Solomon with fresh clarity. Elizabeth's plan had seemed clever at the time, granting him freedom while preserving her secret. But in practice, it had made him a hunted man with nowhere truly safe to go. "What do I do now?" he asked, voicing the question that had haunted him since leaving Oakhaven. Martha was silent for a long moment, considering. "The original route north is compromised, but there are others, less traveled, More dangerous, but potentially effective. She looked at him thoughtfully. The clerical disguise worked once. It might work again, especially if you're willing to maintain it for the duration of your journey. Pretend to be a preacher, Solomon questioned, uncertain. Not pretend, Martha corrected him. Be one. You can read scripture, you carry yourself with dignity, and you have a powerful testimony of deliverance from bondage. Many escaped slaves have found purpose in ministry. It was a staggering suggestion, not just a disguise but a new identity, a new purpose. Solomon had never imagined such a transformation for himself. "I'll need to leave quickly," he said, accepting the reality of his situation. "If they return with more questions—" "Tonight," Martha agreed. "I have a letter to write first. There's someone who needs to know what's happening." "Who?" Solomon asked. "Another station keeper further north, someone who can help arrange a more permanent solution for you." Martha paused, studying him intently. "Tell me, Solomon Thomas, what did you dream of doing with your freedom before all this happened?" The question caught him off guard. In the desperate rush to escape and survive, he hadn't had time to contemplate what freedom might actually mean beyond the absence of chains. "I thought perhaps I might teach," he admitted, "like my mother taught me to read in secret. Help others learn what was forbidden to us." Martha nodded approvingly. A worthy calling, and one that could complement the ministry well. She gestured to his clerical garb. "For now, this is your protection, but in time, it could become your truth if you choose it." As Martha set about writing her letter, Solomon contemplated this strange turn in his journey. He had left Oakhaven carrying Elizabeth Caldwell's sins, only to find himself donning the mantle of a spiritual leader. Was this God's plan for him all along? Or merely another necessary disguise in his quest for true freedom? The blood-stained journal page seemed to burn in his hand, a tangible reminder of the dark bargain that had started him on this path. After a moment's reflection, Solomon made a decision. He approached the small fire in Martha's hearth, and after one final look at the evidence of his pact with Elizabeth, he cast the page into the flames. Martha looked up from her writing, watching as the paper blackened and curled. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "That was your only leverage against her." "It was also my last tie to bondage," Solomon replied, watching the blood oath disappear into ash. "Whatever happens now, I choose to move forward, not back." As darkness fell, Solomon prepared to continue his journey. Martha had arranged for a farmer sympathetic to the abolitionist cause to transport him north in a hidden compartment beneath his wagon, using the preacher disguise as additional protection during checkpoints. "Remember," Martha told him as they said their farewells, "your strength comes not just from what you're running from, but what you're running toward. Find purpose in your freedom, Solomon, and it will sustain you through the darkest times." Solomon nodded, her words resonating deeply. "Thank you for everything. I won't forget." "One last thing," Martha said, pressing a small Bible into his hands. "If you're to be Reverend Thomas, you'll need this. Let it guide your way." As Solomon departed Sister Martha's cottage that night, continuing his dangerous journey toward the North Star, he carried with him not just the trappings of a minister, but the beginning of a new understanding of his own liberation. The confession journal was ash, the blood oath dissolved. Elizabeth Caldwell and Oakhaven plantation lay behind him, fading with each mile he traveled. What lay ahead remained uncertain, filled with danger and promise in equal measure. But Solomon Thomas, now Reverend Thomas to those he encountered, moved forward with growing purpose. His freedom, purchased with blood and secrets, would not be wasted. He would build something meaningful from it, something that might in time help others escape the bonds he had left behind. And far away in Alabama, Elizabeth Caldwell continued her own dangerous performance, never knowing that the evidence of her crime had been reduced to ash, that her confessor had truly become a man of God, carrying not her sins, but the flame of liberty northward into the night. In the years that followed, Solomon Thomas established himself as Reverend Thomas in a small but growing black community in Canada. There, beyond the reach of the Fugitive Slave Act, he created a school that served as both educational center and station on the Underground Railroad, helping countless others achieve the freedom he had found. Occasionally, news would reach him from the American South. Elizabeth Caldwell eventually remarried, her status as a wealthy plantation owner apparently undiminished by the scandal of her runaway slave. Oak Haven continued to operate, though rumors persisted about the strange circumstances of the first Mr. Caldwell's death. Solomon never spoke of Elizabeth's confession again, not even to those closest to him. Some secrets, he had learned, were best left buried, like the ashes of a blood oath, scattered by the winds of change and liberty. The truth that had once bound them remained silent, allowing both to forge new lives from the ashes of their strange covenant, one built on blood, confession, and the universal human yearning for freedom.